1960s was a decade of change to civil rights, bringing in our decimal currency. Beatlemania hit Australia, and the Vietnam War divided the nation. Men landed on the moon, and Menzies was to become the longest-serving Prime Minister of Australia. And for the building industry, Harry Seidler's Australia Square Tower became one of the country's most iconic skyscrapers, built by Civil and Civic. The Sydney Masonic Centre appeared to float above street level, built by KB Hutchinson. And in 1973, on the 100th anniversary of the NBA, the Sydney Opera House was officially opened by Queen Elizabeth II. In the 60s, high-rises created the most dramatic sights of the time, with dogmen riding loads to their destinations, then riding the hook back to street level. Crane drivers and crew were seen as semi-skilled workers. Tradesmen, including carpenters, bricklayers and tilers, were considered skilled, both groups being represented by different unions. The Building Workers Industrial Union, BWIU, and the Australian Builders Labourers Federation, the BLF. The BWIU had expanded to cover the entire building industry in the 1940s, and by the 60s it was a force to be reckoned with, often clashing with the NBA, as Tony Bleasdale, former Building Workers Industrial Union official, now Mayor of Blacktown, explains.
The Building Workers Industrial Union represented carpenters, bricklayers, wall and floor tilers, eventually gyprock fixers. The Builders Labourers Federation were general labourers. They controlled often the delivery of materials in particular. They did lots of the manual work involved in the excavations and digging on building construction sites. Look, the union movement in the 60s, both organisations were very, very competitive, politically had a different view in regards to dealing with industrial relations, and of course often were at loggerheads in regards to demarcation, and eventually that spilled over into the 70s in so many different ways.
The unions pushed for better working conditions for their members, and in 1969 fought for a national long service scheme. However, long service leave schemes were a state-by-state issue. In New South Wales, the NBA worked with the unions, particularly the Building Trades Group of Unions, and supported the passage of the Building and Construction Industry Long Service Leave Act in 1974. This was a rare moment of unity at a time of widespread industrial disputation. Through the 70s, increased industrial action on sites, including the world's first green bans to protect historic sites, forced the NBA to increase their industrial relations team. And Tabba was one of that team.
When I first started, and I didn't have much to do with them at the time, it was the Monday Owens era of the green bans. And it was, the faster the police got people off cranes that were manning cranes and putting bans on, the faster they took them to court, the faster they got out. And then they went to another site. It was completely crazy. We had marches against the NBA, both in the old building and this building. We had deregistration proceedings later on as I got more involved.
Past President Barry O'Mara remembers the impact Anne had on the unions.
I met Anne Tabba when she first started Master Builders. She became very, very experienced in industrial relations. She nearly drove the unions crazy because when she appeared in the commission, she spoke so quietly and so precisely that they had trouble listening to her.
The industry was plagued with disputation, and it really was turbulent in terms of how the relationship between the building industry builders and the trade union movement was really on a knife's edge. Constant disputation, constant demarcation, constant issues about wages and conditions. The union movement decided that they would campaign to introduce full pay on workers' compensation. Up until that point, there was no full pay on workers' compensation. If you were injured, it was a long, lengthy process before anybody received a dollar. But when the campaign commenced, the industry came to a halt. John Elder and the Master Builders Association, who convinced their members and others that this was a normal, acceptable claim that needed to be fixed. And of course, both parties finally came to an agreement on that.
The disruptions that drew the greatest media attention in the 70s were the green bans. These were bans that unions and their members put on development sites that threatened wildlife, nature, or significant heritage sites, and they were fueled by passionate public support. The clashes often became violent. Andrew Ferguson, past New South Wales BWRU Secretary, remembers.
Well, the Green Ban movement was something that was launched in the 1970s, and I give principal recognition to Jack Mundy, who was the Secretary of the Builders Labourers Federation. And I know there was many other unionists and people more broadly in the community supporting the Green Ban movement, but Jack Mundy became the embodiment of green bans, and in addition to looking after the wages and working conditions for the Builders Labourers Federation, and also the Building Workers Industrial Union had a long tradition of taking up issues of heritage, protecting the rocks and many of the iconic historical buildings around Sydney.
If we're talking about saving Sydney, if we're talking about saving our environment, well then the people from the Loo, the people from Victoria Street, the people from the Rocks, from Waterloo, they should be at that meeting today.
We had scores of green bans. The Finger Wharf was one of them. The state government announced that they were going to imminently demolish the Finger Wharf at Woolloomooloo in Sydney. And in actual fact, a Master Builders member had the contract, and they were poised to move in with the jackhammers and the bulldozers. And because of the overwhelming community support, the Green Ban was successful. The government backed down, and it's one of the great treasures that remains in our great city of Sydney.
The Green Ban's tendency for violent demonstrations finally became its undoing. The MBA was able to challenge the bans on that basis and numerous other issues.